When Apple released the iOS 14, there was an option behind the accessibility tab of the settings limit maximum frame rate to 60 frames per second. Now, what makes this option interesting is the fact that there hasn't been an iPhone which has a display that has a refresh rate more than that of 60 Hz. So everybody started speculating that the iPhones releasing in 2020 would have a high refresh rate screen of 90 Hz or probably even 120 Hz. Because otherwise, why the hell would Apple even give such an option in the iOS 14, right? And it's not happening. So in a year where every manufacturer is trying to include a high refresh rate screen in their flagships, why is Apple not doing it? Well, let's find out. Displays aren't static. Content and motion appears to be smooth on your phone screen because every pixel updates to display the latest content from your handset's processor. That means rapid movement of still images just like a flipbook. You draw one picture per page and change the next page ever so slightly. When these pages are flipped fast enough, they trick your brain and makes you believe that they are moving. But this doesn't happen randomly. Panels update their content at regular intervals known as the refresh rate. The refresh rate measures how often does the phone's display update itself. In other words, it's how often the content on the display changes and is measured in Hertz. The human visual system can process from 10 to 12 images per second and perceive them individually, while any number of images more than that is perceived as motion. But even at slightly more than 12 images per second, the motion seems to be jerky until the number of frames per second in a video goes above the flicker fusion threshold of the human eye. A 60 Hz display refreshes 60 times per second, a 90 Hz is 90 times per second, and a 120 Hz is 120 times per second. So, a 120 Hz display refreshes twice as fast as the 60 Hz panel and 4 times as fast as a 30 Hz panel. Higher refresh rate displays make moving content look and feel smoother and snappier. Since the first iPhone's launch in 2007 till today, iPhones had a 60 Hz refresh rate. That is more than twice as much as the traditional TVs, which makes the animations like pinch to zoom look buttery smooth. 120 Hz will feel even smoother, and that's why Apple introduced it in the iPad, calling it ProMotion, and that has an adaptive refresh rate, which means that it'll push 120 Hz whenever required, like pinching to zoom, other screen animations, or in games, making them much more smooth. Otherwise, it'll reduce the refresh rate according to the content, preserving the cinematic look of something like a Hollywood movie by showing them at 24 FPS as well as saving battery. I've discussed about the science behind the frame rate and refresh rate much more in depth in a separate video, which I'll link right here in the cards. Also, in 2019, I made a video predicting why the iPhones will never have USB-C, which again holds up to this day, and I'll link that as well here in the cards. So, given all the positives, here are the reasons why Apple is not including the high refresh rate screen in the iPhone 12 lineup. With the COVID-19 rocking the supply chain, Apple has shifted from their regular back-to-school schedule of the iPhone launch to October. One of the biggest problems that Apple now faces is to find a manufacturer who can mass-produce OLEDs having high refresh rate screen at the scale of iPhone demand with the given situation. Even if companies like Samsung does take up the challenge, it'll always come with the terms and conditions, and the worst thing that Apple wants right now is a further delay in the release of the iPhone. While the screen refreshes more times, it obviously consumes more battery. This is quite evident in phones like the Galaxy S20 Ultra or the Galaxy Note 20, which do have this feature. The last year's iPhones were the champions in battery life, and at the end of the day, anybody would always think whether I want a slightly smoother display or a 4 hours extra battery life. And I think the answer should be evident. iPhone OLED displays are probably the best in the market. Even though the high refresh rate OLEDs are emerging, they have plenty of ground to cover. I'm not too sure whether there are any of them which provide the same brightness, contrast and color accuracy as the current displays, which is another big factor for Apple. Finally, it all comes down to how much money you can make by selling your next product. And when you think about the broad perspective, the refresh rate hardly makes any difference for the average Joe, but will only attract the enthusiasts and probably the gamers who will make up an insignificant portion of the market. Remember, this is Apple. They are always ready to wait until the technology becomes perfect, like they waited until 2017 to use OLEDs in iPhone. Also, when they released the iPhone XR in 2018, it didn't even have a full HD display, due to which most of the reviewers, including me, roasted Apple. But then, Apple made us look like fools when the iPhone XR went on to become the largest selling phone for that year, and they even used the same display in the iPhone 11. The point being, the average Joe doesn't care. So, why Apple doesn't put a high refresh rate screen? Because for selling the new iPhone, Apple doesn't need to put one in it.